In a quiet suburban neighborhood, Craig, a thoughtful, reserved man who treasures his hard-won sanctuary, finds his peace suddenly shattered by the unexpected sounds of splashing water and boisterous laughter emanating from his own backyard. In that disquieting moment, the familiar calm of his home gives way to an unforeseen conflict, as uninvited guests breach the very space he has worked so hard to protect. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe in standing up for personal boundaries, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Craig had lived in his modest, single-story house for a little over a month when everything started unraveling. A tidy man by nature, he prized his privacy the way others might prize rare collectibles or sports trophies. His front yard was neatly trimmed, the hedges carefully shaped. The interior of his home was organized in a way that reflected his character. Small collections of books, vinyl records, a few family photos on side tables, and not much else. He had no interest in flaunting his possessions or trying to keep up with neighbors who seemed locked in a permanent competition of who could drive the fanciest car or own the newest gadget. He simply wanted a quiet life in a place he'd worked long and hard to purchase. The day Craig first met Tim, it felt like a ritual of forced politeness. Tim was boisterous and friendly at face value. He came right over when he saw Craig unloading boxes, offering to help carry a heavy dresser. Tim had a wide smile and that casual suburban swagger, wearing a bright polo shirt, khaki shorts, and a pair of expensive-looking sandals. He had a firm handshake and an eagerness that put Craig on guard. Craig thanked him but politely declined the offer for extra muscle. He explained, with a faint smile, that he had only a few more boxes left and he could manage. Tim insisted, but eventually backed down when Craig insisted right back. Looking back, Craig couldn't pinpoint a specific moment that foretold the trouble to come. Nothing about their first meeting signaled that this neighborly cordiality would soon morph into an ongoing conflict. It took a few more weeks of their paths crossing, Tim walking his two dogs while Craig was trimming bushes, Tim waving from across the street when Craig left for work. Craig was cordial, responding with small smiles or nods, though he preferred not to linger in conversation. In truth, he carried with him certain wariness, a sense that he had to guard himself. Being a single black man in a predominantly white neighborhood, he was painfully aware of how misunderstandings or overfamiliarities could turn sour. More than once in his life, he'd experienced situations in which trying too hard to befriend the neighbors backfired in unpleasant and even humiliating ways. The conflict, as it so often does, began small. One Sunday afternoon, Craig noticed that Tim's twin nephews, he later learned they were nephews, not his own kids, were kicking a soccer ball in Craig's driveway. He had never met them, but he saw their red hair and the fact that they looked around 10 or 11, clearly family to Tim, who also had a shock of ginger hair. At first, Craig told himself it was no big deal. Kids often overflow into the nearest open space without thinking. But as he was about to head inside with his groceries, he saw one of them running around his car, tripping on the side mirror, nearly knocking it loose. He sighed, tension lining his shoulders, but ultimately decided to let it pass. No harm done. He figured they'd lose interest soon and scurry back to Tim's house. They didn't. In fact, moments later, the ball flew up onto Craig's carefully planted shrubs, snapping a branch off one of his rose bushes. Craig gritted his teeth, put the last of his groceries by the door, and strode outside. The kids froze mid-chase. One of them picked up the ball, peering at Craig with wide eyes. Taking a deep breath, Craig asked them politely not to play soccer in his driveway anymore. He tried to keep his voice warm, but inside, he felt that old fear of being perceived as too stern, too intimidating. The twins apologized hastily, then ran off. It wasn't a huge incident, but it was the first whisper of intrusion on Craig's sense of boundaries. Less than a week later, the intrusions graduated from a trifling annoyance to a deeper breach. One Sunday morning, as Craig finished mowing his backyard lawn, he turned off the machine and heard splashing. Not just a light splash, real commotion, laughter, the distinct sound of people moving through water. Confused, he walked around the hedges and nearly dropped his water bottle. Several teenagers, some who looked like Tim's nephews, were lounging in his in-ground pool. He froze, heart pounding. The nerve of it left him breathless. His entire reason for purchasing this house, for investing in the maintenance of this pool, was to have a private refuge, a place where he could unwind and escape the world. Instead, he saw a cluster of kids in swimsuits who definitely did not belong there. He cleared his throat, stepping into the pool area. They all turned to him, startled. A tall boy in red swim trunks straightened, tension on his features. Craig spoke quietly but firmly. "What are you doing here?" The boy blinked. Tim said it was okay. You know, that we could swim here if you weren't using it." Craig clenched his jaw. He glanced toward Tim's house, but saw no sign of him. "This is my property," he said tightly. "No one is allowed here without my permission. Get out now, please." The teenagers scrambled to their feet, scurrying off with half-muttered apologies. They looked more embarrassed than confrontational. But for Craig, it wasn't so easy to brush off. His sanctuary had been invaded, and Tim's casual assurance, assuming Tim had really said that, made Craig's blood pressure rise. Why would Tim tell these kids they could use someone else's pool? That afternoon, Craig stewed in his frustration. He paced through his living room, trying to decide how best to address the matter. He considered a short conversation with Tim, explaining boundaries. He sat down, rubbed his hands together, then shook his head. Yes, that was the adult thing to do. But he felt unsettled, remembering a conversation he'd overheard at a barbecue in his old neighborhood. A friend had warned him, when you're a black man asserting boundaries, especially to someone who thinks they're being nice, it can be twisted. They might call you aggressive. The memory didn't keep him from wanting to speak up, but it did put an extra layer of caution on everything he did. Eventually, he walked across the street and knocked on Tim's door. After a moment, Tim answered, wearing a casual grin. "Craig," he said brightly. "What brings you by?" Craig did his best to keep calm. "Tim, we need to talk. Your nephews, or maybe some of your friends' kids, were in my pool this morning." Tim shrugged. "Oh, that. Yeah, the twins said they were going to take a dip. Figured you wouldn't mind since you weren't using it." Craig inhaled slowly, controlling his tone. "I do mind, Tim. I mind a lot. It's trespassing. I bought this place for privacy, and it's my responsibility if someone gets hurt. You can't just send them over." Tim frowned, tapping a finger on the doorframe. "Come on, man. It's just a pool. We're neighbors. Neighbors share things, right?" Craig's frustration surged. "Not like this," he replied. "I'd appreciate it if you told everyone that my yard and pool are off limits unless I specifically invite them. Are we clear?" Tim gave a half-smile that didn't meet his eyes. Sure. I'll let them know. No problem." But it was a problem, and that became even clearer as days passed and Tim's breezy attitude only turned more presumptuous. Craig tried to give the benefit of the doubt. Maybe Tim would let it sink in that Craig took his space seriously. However, that sense of confidence was shattered the very next Saturday when, after a morning of errands, Craig came home to find Tim himself, and a group of about 10 people, spread out around the pool, grilling burgers as if it were a public park. The laughter died as Craig entered through his side gate, groceries still clutched in hand. Tim, spatula in his grip, waved. "Hey man, hope you don't mind we're beating the heat." Mind was an understatement. Craig set his groceries on a nearby chair, breathing fast. "We talked about this," he said. "You can't just come here without permission." Tim turned back to the grill, flipping a burger. "Relax, buddy," he said. "We'll clean up, no harm done." Craig stared at him, stunned by the lack of apology. With forced calm, he said, "I want you gone, right now. All of you." Some grumbling passed through the small crowd, but eventually they packed up and filed out, leaving behind a few crushed soda cans and half-empty chip bags that made Craig's skin crawl. He spent a good hour cleaning up, each piece of trash feeling like a personal insult. The intrusion was bad enough, but to leave a mess behind, this was worse. That night, he found himself unable to sleep, replaying the moment Tim waved at him like it was no big deal. He recalled Tim's casual, "We're neighbors, we share" refrain. Something about that phrase made him uneasy, as if Tim had a fundamental belief that Craig's space was essentially community property whenever Tim felt like using it. It went beyond simple boundary crossing. It was a challenge to Craig's autonomy, and it made him feel powerless in a place that should have been his refuge. Craig tried a more formal approach next. He wrote a direct but respectful letter, explaining that his property was private and that further trespasses would have consequences. He left it in Tim's mailbox the following morning. For a few days it seemed to work. The backyard was blissfully quiet. Craig found himself able to breathe easier. He swam a few peaceful laps after work one evening, enjoying the stillness of the water and the summer light filtering through tall oak trees. He thought, maybe Tim finally got it. Maybe a polite but firm letter was enough to hammer the point home. But part of him stayed on guard, half expecting the other shoe to drop. It dropped the next weekend. Craig returned from a Sunday grocery run. He liked to do them when the stores were less crowded, and heard music thumping from behind his house. Dread churned in his stomach as he walked briskly through the side gate. Sure enough, Tim and a group of friends were lounging by the pool, beers in hand, some of them partially blocking the path to Craig's back door. Tim's wife, who he now knew was named Suzanne, wore a big sun hat and offered him a flustered wave. Two men from Tim's group, people Craig didn't recognize, were rummaging through a portable cooler, cracking jokes in voices that carried across the yard. It was the last straw. Craig felt his cheeks burn. He had tried civility, he'd tried direct warnings and written reminders. None of it mattered. Worse, Tim was rapidly turning Craig's property into a casual extension of his own domain. He walked straight up to Tim, ignoring the stares of the others. No. Tim cocked his head. "Hey, slow down, buddy. We just got here." Craig's heart pounded. "I'm not your buddy, Tim. Get out." A hush fell over the group. Tim's expression hardened. For a moment, Craig wondered if Tim might argue more forcefully or even get physical. But after a tense standoff, Tim sighed dramatically, tossed his half-empty beer can into the cooler, and stood. "Fine. You want to be like that, we'll leave." He motioned to his friends, who grudgingly packed their things. Even after they left, the anger in Craig's chest wouldn't settle. He gathered up the trash they'd abandoned, noticing globs of ketchup on his patio furniture and a big wet footprint in front of his sliding glass door. The word "violated" swirled in his head, mixing with darker, older memories of times he'd been disrespected. He felt a surge of near panic. This was supposed to be his safe space. He had to take action. He considered contacting the police, but the idea raised all sorts of alarms in his mind. He'd heard too many stories about how calling law enforcement on white neighbors could backfire or cause him more trouble. At best, Tim would be told to knock it off. At worst, Craig would be labeled the problem. He also feared that such an escalation could incite Tim to retaliate in ways Craig couldn't anticipate. Instead, he hatched a plan that was both indirect and unmistakable. If he couldn't rely on social mores to keep these people out, maybe a visual deterrent would do the trick. That night, he researched superchlorinating techniques, ways to temporarily make pool water unappealing without causing lasting damage. He learned about adding a surplus of chlorine that would cloud up the water and create a heavy chemical smell for a few days, rendering the pool unusable. He also read up on harmless foaming agents sometimes used in novelty pool parties. If done right, it would look disastrous, but in reality, it would be superficial. Craig felt a slight pang of guilt, but the anger and sense of violation overshadowed it. This was his home, and he had every right to protect it. On Friday evening, just before sundown, Craig put his plan in motion. He'd bought large containers of chlorine shock and a small supply of the foaming agent from a pool supply store across town. He waited until the last of the daylight began to fade so there'd be no prying eyes. He meticulously measured the chemicals into a large bucket, dissolving them in water according to the guidelines he'd found online. Then he poured the mixture into the pool in a slow, steady stream. The effect was immediate. The water began to bubble, releasing thin vapors that hung close to the surface. He sprinkled in the foaming agent and stirred the water gently with a long pole. Within minutes, a thick layer of bubbles formed, completely obscuring the once pristine clarity of the pool. The following morning, the pool looked downright nightmarish: cloudy water, random patches of white foam, and a pungent chemical scent that reached clear across the yard. Satisfied but uneasy, Craig retreated inside. The next step was to wait for the inevitable intrusion and watch how Tim and his entourage reacted. It didn't take long. That very afternoon, music erupted from Tim's yard, drifting over the fence, and soon enough, a gaggle of kids trooped around the side, apparently to jump into the pool. Craig watched from his living room window, heart thudding. He saw them reach the edge of the deck and freeze. The chatter died instantly. One boy poked the water with his toe, then jerked back. Another coughed at the chlorine vapors. They stood there uncertainly, as though expecting the water to magically clear up. Then, to Craig's grim satisfaction, the kids retreated. It wasn't long before Tim himself appeared, scowling. He looked around like he expected someone to explain the cause of this chemical catastrophe, but Craig stayed inside, out of sight. Tim peered into the water, grimaced, and let out a shout that was probably a curse. Then he stomped away, the group trailing behind him. The yard was silent for the rest of the day. Craig felt a surge of victory. It wasn't the conversation-based resolution he'd initially hoped for, but it was effective. He planned to keep the pool in this shocked state for a few days, enough time to deter further trespassing. After that, he could fix the chemistry and get it back to normal. The only fear nibbling at the back of his mind was how Tim would react in the long run. A rational person might see it as a clear sign that the property owner was serious and respect that. But Tim's casual disregard for boundaries thus far made it hard to guess. Late that evening, as Craig was winding down, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number, but he strongly suspected who it was. The message read, "What the hell did you do to the pool? You've gone too far." Craig stared at the screen, a ripple of unease passing through him. So Tim had his number now, presumably from a neighbor or some community directory. He typed back a short reply: "I treated my pool with chemicals. That's my right. No one is allowed on my property without permission." No further texts arrived. For the moment, anyway. Sunday passed without incident. Craig used the day to quietly rebalance the pH in the pool, though he didn't completely fix the water yet. He went for a walk in the late afternoon, hoping to calm his nerves. Passing the sidewalk in front of Tim's house, he saw Tim's kids, or nephews, or some extended relatives, Craig had lost track, playing in the front yard. He made eye contact with one of them, a small boy with big hazel eyes, who stared back at him shyly. Craig felt a pang of sympathy for the kids, who were likely caught in the middle of adult disagreements. He gave the boy a tiny nod of acknowledgement. The boy watched him pass, not saying a word. That evening, while Craig was watering his hydrangeas, Tim appeared in the gap between their yards. Craig noticed him first, his broad silhouette easy to pick out. Tim cleared his throat. "Craig," he said, voice tense. "You got a minute?" Craig shut off the hose and approached cautiously. "What's up?" Tim folded his arms over his chest, eyes flicking to the messy foam still lurking in corners of the pool. "Look, I know we've had our differences. But this stunt you pulled, my wife's furious. Thinks you poisoned the pool or something." Craig bit back an angry retort. "It's not poison, Tim. It's just a superchlorination procedure. Perfectly normal pool maintenance. If it looks uninviting, that's the point. You weren't respecting my rules, so I took measures to discourage further trespassing." Tim's jaw tightened. "We're neighbors," he said with exasperation. "Neighbors are supposed to help each other out, share the good times. Not pull these weird sabotage moves." Craig's face went hot. "Is that what you call it when you send a crowd onto my private property whenever you feel like it? Sharing the good times? This is my backyard, Tim. It's not a community park. Tim opened his mouth to argue, but then his gaze shifted. Craig realized Tim was noticing the flicker of anger on Craig's face, the tenseness in his stance. It might have caught Tim off guard to see Craig so openly confrontational. Usually, Craig was more reserved. After a beat, Tim muttered, "Fine. Do what you want. You always do anyway." He turned and walked off, leaving Craig standing there with an unsettled feeling that made his hands shake slightly. Monday came and went without further incident, and Craig found himself immersed in his job. He did remote IT support for a small tech firm. While sitting at his desk, he occasionally glanced out the window, half expecting to see Tim or some visitors creeping around the yard. Nothing happened. By Tuesday, Craig decided it was safe to begin restoring the pool to normal. After hours of balancing chemicals, adding fresh water, and running the filtration system, the water started looking clearer. He tested the pH, nodded in satisfaction, and let it run overnight. Just as the chemical conflict seemed to subside, an unexpected phone call jolted him. The local elementary school rang him up in midweek, surprising him. He picked up, curious and slightly worried. Why would a school call him? The voice on the other end was that of a woman identifying herself as Ms. Stevens, a teacher. She asked if he knew a boy named Sam, who apparently lived in the same neighborhood. Craig paused. He remembered the hazel-eyed boy from Tim's yard, but no, he didn't really know him. Miss Stevens explained that Sam had shared some concerning details about a neighbor problem during a journaling session in class. When pressed, Sam had mentioned feeling scared about neighbors always yelling and people messing up the backyard. Miss Stevens had gleaned that Sam was referencing an adult named Tim and another adult named Craig. The teacher politely asked if everything was all right and if there was something the school should know about. Craig was caught off guard. He stammered that everything was fine, that there was just a neighborly dispute, nothing that involved Sam directly. Miss Stevens hesitated, then said that Sam seemed very upset and that if things escalated, the school counselor could help mediate. Craig thanked her but politely declined assistance. After the call, he sat for a long time, phone still in hand. So this was how it was impacting the kids. The thought weighed on him. When the weekend rolled around, the strangest thing happened. Tim's house was quiet. No loud music, no visitors breezing into Craig's yard. Craig felt a cautious relief, but also a flicker of empathy. Maybe Tim finally understood, or maybe the talk with the teacher had reached him via Sam. Either way, the tension in the air seemed to thin out. One day bled into the next, a soft calm settling over the block. The mild weather made it perfect for evening strolls, and Craig began taking short walks after dinner to clear his head. He'd pass by Tim's place, noticing the cars in the driveway, the muffled glow of a television behind closed curtains, but no sign of the large gatherings that used to spill out onto the sidewalks. Then, a subtle shift. Tim started nodding at Craig when they crossed paths, a small, respectful nod. Craig returned it, unsure if this was a truce or just an unspoken arrangement to keep the peace in public. In the back of his mind, though, he couldn't forget Miss Stevens's phone call. The fact that a little boy in Tim's orbit was so affected by the tension that he ended up crying to his teacher weighed heavily on him. Craig found himself feeling guilty, even though he believed he had the right to protect his property. He began to wonder if there was a better, more constructive way to handle the conflict. Things seemed to settle into a new normal, an uneasy calm, until one Friday evening when Tim's wife, Suzanne, showed up at Craig's doorstep. She looked nervous, hugging her elbows as she spoke in a soft voice. "Craig," she began, "I'm sorry to bother you, but Tim and I had a disagreement. He keeps saying you're overreacting, but I can tell he's upset. He's been complaining to his family, saying you're trying to isolate us. I'm worried about the kids hearing all this. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything." Craig, momentarily speechless, invited her inside. He offered her a seat on the couch, feeling the awkwardness in the air. Suzanne explained that Tim's extended family had been using the pool all along, even before Craig bought the house, back when an older couple lived there. Apparently, That couple let Tim's relatives use the pool whenever they wanted as a neighborly gesture. When that couple moved away, Tim assumed the tradition would continue. "I'm not excusing him," she said hurriedly, "but I think that's why he acted like it was normal. He should have asked. I tried to tell him, but he's stubborn." Craig listened, arms folded, a swirl of emotions passing through him. So that was it. Tim believed some unspoken arrangement carried over to new ownership. That didn't justify anything, but it gave Craig a little insight. He sighed, running a hand over his short hair. Well, that explains some of it, but still, he crossed a line. More than once. Suzanne nodded. "I know. I really hope things can cool down. Sam has been quiet lately, and he's not even Tim's child. He's my nephew. He's only 9 and hates conflict. There's a lot going on with his family, and we've been taking care of him. He's been hearing all this tension, and it's making him cry at school." Craig felt a pang of sympathy, remembering the teacher's phone call. "I'm sorry about Sam. I didn't mean for it to affect him." Suzanne gave him a wan smile. "I know. Listen, if Tim gives you trouble again, please tell me. I'll try to handle it. I just wanted you to know we're not bad people. Just a little stuck in our ways." Craig nodded, feeling the edges of his anger soften. He walked Suzanne to the door and bid her good night, left with a confusing mixture of relief and lingering apprehension. Over the next couple of weeks, life in the neighborhood stabilized. Tim waved at Craig a few times, hesitant but no longer scowling. He even offered a small greeting about the weather. Craig nodded back, reciprocating with a polite, if cautious, smile. The pool remained blissfully off-limits to the rest of the block, and Craig savored the chance to enjoy an evening swim without fretting about uninvited guests. Despite the improved atmosphere, Craig felt the tension remained in a kind of truce, rather than a resolution. The memory of Miss Stevens's call and Suzanne's confession about Sam kept nagging at him. He didn't want to be the reason a child felt unsafe or upset. At the same time, he refused to cede control of his own property. His mind drifted to an idea. Maybe he could host a barbecue for the neighbors, showing them that while he valued his privacy, he wasn't an unapproachable recluse. If done on his terms, it might foster some sense of mutual respect. He mulled it over for days, going back and forth on whether he was inviting more trouble than good. Eventually, he decided to give it a try. He planned the event meticulously, a Saturday afternoon gathering open to a few select neighbors, including Tim's household. Before distributing invitations, he went shopping for supplies, a new set of grill tools, enough meat and vegetarian options, drinks, and extra folding chairs. It felt strange to invest in a communal event after spending weeks trying to guard his space, but a small voice in his head reminded him that healthy boundaries don't preclude neighborly gestures, they just define how those gestures happen. On Monday evening, Craig stopped by Tim's place. Tim answered, looking surprised but not unhappy to see Craig. "Hey," Tim said, subdued. Craig handed him a small printed invitation. "I'm hosting a barbecue this weekend. Would you and your family like to come?" Tim's eyebrows rose. "Really? After all that's happened?" Craig shrugged. "I figure maybe we can wipe the slate clean. Or at least start over. I'm not saying I'll let you come swim whenever you want," he added, giving a wry half-smile, "but maybe we can meet in the middle, know each other better, so this doesn't keep happening." Tim hesitated, then cracked a grin. "All right. Thanks for inviting us. I'll talk to Suzanne, see if we can bring something." Craig nodded. "You can bring some side dishes if you want." The rest of the invitations went out to a half-dozen other neighbors, the Watsons across the street, an elderly couple who sometimes complimented Craig's flowers, and a small family 2 doors down with a toddler. Over the next few days, Craig spruced up his backyard. He arranged the furniture to maximize comfortable seating, trimmed the hedges to a neat uniform shape, and made sure the pool water was crystal clear. Every step felt like reclaiming a space that had been overshadowed by conflict. The morning of the barbecue arrived bright and sunny, with birds chirping and a mild breeze rustling the leaves. Craig set up a table with condiments, plates, cups, and a large cooler filled with ice and sodas. He double-checked the grill, laid out burger patties, hot dogs, and some marinated veggies for skewers. He'd even made his mother's old-fashioned potato salad, feeling a twinge of nostalgia that softened his nerves. People trickled in around noon. The Watsons arrived first, offering a warm thanks for the invite and a plate of homemade cookies. The next family showed up with their toddler, who toddled uncertainly on the grass, giggling whenever someone waved at him. Tim and Suzanne arrived soon after with Sam in tow, balancing a bowl of pasta salad and a pitcher of lemonade. Craig made it a point to bend down slightly and greet Sam in a friendly tone, trying to ease any tension the boy might feel. Tim gave Craig a respectful nod, no trace of the old swagger or dismissiveness. Suzanne even offered a quick, grateful smile. Conversation flowed, albeit haltingly at first. Craig found himself flipping burgers and fielding curious questions from neighbors who hadn't gotten to know him yet. Some asked about his job, others complimented the tidy yard. He explained that he liked reading in his downtime, which led to a short talk about local libraries. Tim drifted in and out of groups, chatting amicably. He seemed a little quieter than usual, not the brash figure who had once announced his presence in Craig's backyard so brazenly. Craig wondered if Tim felt embarrassed about the past weeks. After an hour or two, the kids who'd come started eyeing the pool. They must have heard about the fiasco of the superchlorinated water, or at least recognized the significance of that beautiful stretch of blue. One of them asked politely if they could swim, glancing at Craig for permission. He hesitated, but realized this was part of hosting. If he wanted to maintain control of his environment while also building trust, he should set the rules. "Sure," he said, "as long as there's an adult watching you, and you follow my guidelines. No running around the deck, no jumping off the deep end unless you know how to swim well, and definitely pick up after yourselves." The kids nodded eagerly, rushing to ask their parents if they had swimsuits in the car. Tim overheard and offered, "I can keep an eye on them if you'd like." Craig nodded slowly, relieved that Tim was finally recognizing there were boundaries to be observed. Suzanne and Sam sat together at a small patio table. Craig brought them cups of lemonade. "How's everything been?" he asked softly. Suzanne exhaled. "Better." Tim's side of the family realized we were serious when we told them that we can't just use your pool. Sam still hears arguments sometimes, but not about the pool. It's more about, well, family stuff. Her eyes flicked to Sam, who was nibbling on a cookie, swinging his legs. Craig lowered his voice so Sam wouldn't hear. "I'm sorry he got tangled up in this. I never wanted kids to get hurt by adult arguments." She smiled, a bit wan. "He'll be okay. He's got a good counselor at school, and I'm trying to keep him away from all the negativity." Craig nodded, remembering the phone call with Ms. Stevens. He felt some relief that Sam had resources for emotional support. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere lightened. Neighbors laughed over silly anecdotes about local gossip. The kids splashed in the pool under Tim's watchful eye, while Craig kept a discreet distance, focusing on the grill. Suzanne chatted with the Watsons about gardening tips. Sam, having finished his cookie, approached the edge of the pool, a bit shy, and watched the other children. One of them coaxed him into dipping his feet. He let out a tiny laugh, wiggling his toes in the water. Craig observed from across the lawn, reminded that small gestures of kindness could help ease tensions more effectively than 100 scolding words. When the food was nearly gone, people began to pack up. One by one, they thanked Craig for hosting. The air had a pleasant, subdued warmth of post-barbecue satisfaction. Tim stayed behind to help Craig clean up. They worked mostly in silence, picking up cups and plates, dumping them in trash bags. Eventually, Tim cleared his throat. "Craig," he began, not meeting Craig's eyes. "I'm sorry. Really sorry about everything. I guess I assumed things and I should have respected your space." Craig paused, a half-full trash bag in hand. He nodded slowly. "I appreciate it," he replied. "I didn't want to cause all this drama, but I had to stand up for what's mine." Tim let out a breath. "Yeah, I get it now. It's your place, your investment. Not ours to crash. He gave a short, wry laugh. I hope we can keep moving forward without any more stunts, from either of us. Craig smiled ruefully, remembering the swirling foam in the pool. No more stunts, he agreed. That night, alone in his tidy house, Craig reflected on how precarious peace could be. He was relieved that Tim seemed to have finally gotten the message, but he also knew human relationships were rarely that simple. He found himself wanting to create a sense of community. He'd bought this place for solitude, but the barbecue had reminded him that isolation could be just as draining as constant conflict. Maybe this truce would hold. He had a cautious optimism. Over the following weeks, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. Now and then Tim or Suzanne would wave across the street, offer a polite "How are you?" There were no more unannounced visits, and the memory of the chemically clouded pool became more of a cautionary tale than a recurring reality. Craig maintained his regimen of short evening swims, savoring the quiet laps under the dimming twilight sky. Sometimes he'd see Tim or someone from his household glance over from their yard, but there were no attempts to barge in. Craig felt a tentative sense of relief. He still had that prickle of awareness. He wouldn't let down his guard entirely. But for the moment, the tension was gone. Another unexpected occurrence took place a month later, when Miss Stevens, the elementary school teacher, reached out again. This time, it was an email. She explained that Sam had made notable progress in his counseling sessions. He felt safer now that Uncle Tim and the neighbor weren't fighting. Miss Stevens simply wanted to thank Craig for ensuring the conflict was resolved in a way that benefited Sam's peace of mind. Craig felt a strange rush of gratitude that someone out there recognized the effort and the complexity. He wrote back, short and polite, thanking her for the update. Summer began to slip toward autumn. The leaves on the maple in Craig's front yard started turning vivid shades of gold and orange. The pool hours grew shorter. Craig found the water a bit too chilly except on particularly warm afternoons. Meanwhile, Tim's brood seemed content with the natural shift in the season, focusing instead on yard tasks or weekend sports for the kids. Occasionally, Tim would hold a small gathering, but they kept to their own yard. The music never ventured past an acceptable volume, and no uninvited footsteps crossed into Craig's grass. One crisp Saturday morning, while Craig was washing his car, he noticed a small sign hammered into Tim's lawn. A yard sale. A few old chairs, an unused treadmill, some lamps. Tim was lugging out boxes, rummaging for things to sell. Craig, for once, let curiosity override his reticence. He wandered over, a damp towel still draped over his shoulder from drying the car. "Getting rid of some clutter?" he asked. Tim chuckled, wiping sweat from his brow. "We've been meaning to for years. Figured now's a good time." Craig nodded, scanning the items. There was a moment of comfortable silence. Then Tim spoke, clearing his throat awkwardly. "You know, about that barbecue you threw a while back, I never really thanked you for it properly. It meant a lot." Craig shrugged. "I just figured a fresh start would be good for everyone." Tim glanced at him, sincerity in his eyes. "The was. And I'm glad we worked things out before it got worse." They shared a brief smile. Then Tim asked, "Want to poke around, see if there's anything you can use?" "Friend discount." Craig laughed lightly. "Sure, I'll take a look." He didn't buy anything that day, but the small exchange left him with a deeper sense of acceptance. It wasn't a forced politeness or a strained handshake. It was a genuine moment of neighborly calm. When he returned to his yard, Craig felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time, he truly believed that the cycle of intrusions and conflicts was broken. A few days later, he received an invitation taped to his front door. Tim was hosting a small end-of-summer get-together, a family-only thing, but neighbors could drop by if they wanted. The idea of stepping foot in Tim's domain was a little unsettling, but he also felt it might be time to prove that goodwill went both ways. On the day of the event, he strolled over with a bottle of wine. Tim greeted him warmly, introducing Craig to a few relatives who were visiting from out of town. There were no large throngs, no kids stampeding to a forbidden pool. Instead, it was a mild, subdued affair. Craig found himself actually enjoying the conversation, particularly when he discovered that Tim's cousin was an amateur painter who shared tips about capturing the subtle light of sunsets. They chatted for a good half-hour, ignoring the earlier tensions that had so thoroughly set them at odds. In quiet moments, Craig couldn't help reflecting on how fragile the lines between neighbors could be. A misunderstanding, an assumption, and a misguided sense of entitlement had nearly turned his dream home into a war zone. Yet, with patience and some creative boundary setting, the path to coexisting had appeared. He still valued his solitude, but he no longer felt forced into it by fear or conflict. One final test of that truce came unexpectedly. One weekend, Tim was away traveling with extended family. Suzanne approached Craig in a bit of a panic, explaining that their sump pump had malfunctioned and their basement was flooding. She asked if he happened to have any tools or a spare shop vacuum to help clear out water. Craig, who prided himself on being prepared, did indeed have a wet/dry vacuum. He gathered it up and followed Suzanne into their house. The basement was a soggy mess, water pooling in corners, some boxes already soaked. Without hesitation, Craig set up the vacuum, showing Suzanne how to drain the water. Together, they managed to clear most of it within a few hours. By the end, Suzanne was exhausted, face flushed with relief. "Thank you so much," she breathed, hands shaking slightly. "I don't know what we would have done otherwise." Craig gave a small, reassuring nod. "Don't mention it. That's what neighbors are for, right?" She laughed, a genuine laugh that carried none of the tension or awkwardness of the past. "Yes," she said, "the right kind of neighbors." If someone had told Craig months ago that he'd be kneeling on Tim's basement floor, running a wet/dry vacuum to help Tim's wife, he would have scoffed. But there he was, living proof that boundaries didn't have to erase kindness. By the time Tim returned, the crisis was over, and he immediately came by to thank Craig. "I owe you big time," Tim said, sounding more earnest than Craig had ever heard him. Craig shrugged. "We'll call it even." He hesitated, then added, "Just remember, my yard is mine." Tim nodded vigorously. "Understood." Autumn gave way to winter. The leaves turned brittle and fell, and the pool began to gather a light dusting of debris each day. Craig considered investing in a pool cover but decided to do it in the spring. He rarely used the water in the colder months anyway. Snow came early this year, dusting the suburban streets. Craig found himself admiring the hush that fell over everything, the way fresh snow absorbs sound and reflects the soft glow of streetlights at night. Tim's household also quieted. The large gatherings of summer were a distant memory. Instead, Craig saw them occasionally shoveling their driveway or stringing up holiday lights. He found himself offering a nod or wave, which they returned. One evening, Tim's nephew, Sam, saw Craig trudging through the snow with some groceries and rushed over to help open the gate. It was a simple gesture, but it revealed a sense of comfort that had definitely not been there before. By the time spring returned, their relationship had settled into the realm of normalcy. No longer adversaries, not exactly best friends, but comfortable acquaintances who understood each other's boundaries. The pool cover arrived, and Tim offered to help Craig install it one Saturday morning. They worked side by side, occasionally sharing small talk about mundane topics, the neighborhood association's new fence guidelines, the possibility of a local park renovation, Tim's job shift. It felt easy, a far cry from the bristling tension that once marked their every interaction. And Sam, the little boy whose tears had inadvertently triggered outside attention, seemed to be thriving. He'd grown a bit taller, and Craig occasionally spotted him shooting hoops with a friend in Tim's driveway, laughter echoing in the crisp air. Whenever Sam caught sight of Craig, he gave a small grin or wave. Craig would wave back, silently relieved that the days of fear and confusion had passed for the child. In the midst of all this, Craig maintained that sense of watchfulness, not out of fear that Tim would revert to old ways, but out of a deeper recognition that he had to guard his peace. He'd learned the hard way how quickly illusions of harmony could shatter. At the same time, he allowed himself cautious hope. Neighbors could have boundaries, yet still help each other out when genuine need arose. This nuanced perspective was something he appreciated. Maybe, in a way, the conflict had taught him how to strike that balance better than he ever would have on his own. The story of the chemical-laden pool eventually spread through the neighborhood grapevine, though most people heard a sanitized version of it. Something about Craig had a pool mishap and the water got all foamy. A few might have suspected the truth, but either they didn't mind or they respected that it was an internal matter. No one confronted Craig about it. He suspected many neighbors felt a quiet satisfaction that someone had stood up to Tim's earlier sense of entitlement. Over time, as Tim's visits to their houses also presumably toned down, the entire block became a bit calmer. Occasionally, the memory flared in Craig's mind. The day he confronted Tim's entire group, the messy aftermath left by these uninvited guests, the shaky feeling that accompanied the decision to superchlorinate the pool. He didn't regret it, exactly. He believed it was a necessary measure to regain control. But he did note how it was a short-term fix for a deeper issue, the lack of communication and respect. Ultimately, it took more than a stunt to fix that. It took conversation, mutual listening, and a slow building of trust. Funny how that works, he mused. A year after Craig first moved in, he decided to throw another neighborhood barbecue. This time, he'd have a good chunk of people from the block over for a lively spring gathering. He posted a sign-up sheet at the local coffee shop, too, inviting folks to bring a dish to share. Tim and Suzanne were among the first to RSVP, offering to bring a killer marinade for the chicken wings. When the day came, the backyard was awash with conversation and the smells of grilled food. Children dashed around, squealing with laughter, some drifting near the pool to peer into the clear water. This time, though, no one entered without Craig's explicit go-ahead. He laid out pool rules at the start. No one swims unless Craig or another designated adult is present to supervise. Everyone abided, and it felt good. Comfortable. As if the entire fiasco had been an impetus for something better. Suzanne approached Craig partway through the event, smiling widely. "This is great," she said. "Thank you again for inviting us." Craig smiled back. "I'm glad you all came. It's nice to see the place full of people who respect boundaries." She gave a small, understanding nod. Tim meandered over, a plate piled high with wings. He chuckled. "Try these, man, they're top-notch." Craig sampled one, nodding with approval. "Wow, that marinade is legit," he said, half laughing. Tim grinned. "Told you." Through the day, people cycled in and out, bringing side dishes, devouring the main courses, sampling desserts. Craig floated between groups, checking on the grill, making sure the cooler stayed stocked. The tension was nowhere to be found. The children laughed, the adults shared stories, and Craig's backyard felt truly like his own space, one he could share on his terms. Sam even presented Craig with a small hand-drawn thank you card, showing a stick-figure version of Craig next to a pool with a big grin. Craig's heart clenched at the sweetness of the gesture. When dusk settled, the final guests trickled out, and Tim stayed to help tidy up. They worked together in an easy camaraderie, Craig picking up paper plates, Tim emptying the cooler of melted ice. As they parted ways, Tim extended a hand. Craig shook it, feeling none of the old tension. Tim's eyes were sincere. "I appreciate how you handled all this. And thanks for letting me help out." Craig nodded, meeting Tim's gaze squarely. "I'm just glad we could get past that." Tim gave a short laugh. "Yeah, me too." Later that evening, Craig sat on his patio, alone, gazing at the moonlit surface of his pool. The memory of months past flickered through his mind, anger, frustration, that feeling of helpless violation. Now, the water was calm, a soft ripple occasionally stirred by the breeze. The yard was quiet, save for the distant hum of a car passing. He realized with a small smile that he finally felt at home. Not just physically, but emotionally. The tension of racial undertones, the worry of being seen as the hostile neighbor, the fear of having no recourse. It had all settled into a sense of cautious but genuine belonging. He would never take his privacy for granted again, nor would he assume conflict was the only path. He closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling the scent of freshly mowed grass, letting himself appreciate the stillness. He had done it. He'd claimed his space, demanded respect, and somehow forged a connection with the very people who had tested his boundaries in the first place. After a long while, he went inside, turned off the patio lights, and locked the door, feeling safe and content. He couldn't help but think back to that little boy crying to his teacher, describing a horrible family situation and neighbor troubles. If that boy could see this moment, maybe he'd see that even tense conflicts can end in understanding, that a little courage and persistence can go a long way. Above all, Craig hoped Sam and any other child caught in adult drama would learn that boundaries, once enforced and respected, can open pathways rather than slam them shut. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.